Hey team, in this lecture I'm going to be focusing on topics 5.7 and 5.9, talking about the current state of agriculture as an interconnected system known as agribusiness of inputs and processors and retailers. We'll talk about the growth of agriculture into a global system and also changes to sort of the spatial organization, the layout of individual farms and how they've grown over the last couple decades. So we can start by defining this term agribusiness itself. The definition that I've given you reads that it is commercial agriculture that's characterized by the integration of different steps in the food processing industry, usually through ownership by large corporations. Those corporations are sometimes recognizable names like ConAgra or Monsanto or Del Monte you might have seen on your tomatoes or fruits or something as you purchase them. And these companies and other companies like them are referred to as agribusiness because they are not simply focused on any one aspect, but they perform a number of services and jobs along the whole chain of supply for agricultural products, right? So agribusiness refers to this whole system of food production and not just farmers or something like that. So starting with things like inputs and the companies that produce or research those, like fertilizers, biotech, the companies that are researching and developing genetically engineered seeds, for example, tractor companies that are producing, the machines, that are used on farms, the energy companies that sell electricity or oil and fuel and stuff to those farmers. Um, the farmers themselves, right, is what farm production refers to, the people actually growing the food. And then the processing industries, which could be washing of fruits and vegetables, packaging that stuff, freezing it for transportation. It could involve transformation processes, turning wheat into bread or turning soybeans into tofu, or slaughter, right? Taking a live animal and slaughtering it, and chopping it up, and packaging it for sale as steaks or whatever. Um, and then distribution, right? And probably transportation somewhere in there as well, bringing it to these places where it will be sold to consumers and restaurants and grocery stores and so on. And then all kinds of other industries that would be involved, like in the advertising side for certain products, right? Agribusiness refers to these corporations that are involved in many steps along this process, as well as sort of just the industry of agriculture in general and all its various inputs and outputs. This is an image I got showing the sort of food supply chain for Australia, but it works the same in any country, where you can sort of track the supply of food, I guess minus the input stage here, from farmers' property, transported, stored, inventoried to processing centers where it's cleaned or packed or graded, right? Uh, are the apples the right size, the right color? I think that's what they mean sort of by grading. Um, Manufacturing, processing, transformation, wholesale. Those are the stages, like we said, where you're transforming that wheat into bread and so on. Um, and then further transporting that stuff to be distributed at retailers like grocery stores and then on to consumers, right? That is a supply chain, but basically for food, right? All those steps along that supply chain are what we refer to as agribusiness. Agribusiness encourages what is known as vertical integration. And I've included an image on the right hand side of the slide here to remind you of what that is. Vertical integration is a way of organizing a company so that the many stages along the supply chain for a certain product are all controlled by that single company. So as you can see in this example of vertical integration on the right, in talking about sort of the meat industry, um, a company that was practicing vertical integration might control all or most of these steps from raising cattle on a farm to the slaughterhouses that they get sent to. The refrigerated railroad cars might be purchased and owned by that particular meat packing company. The cooled warehouses where it's stored, the meat packing plants, the delivery wagons, etc., all the way until it gets to the grocery store, right? There's many steps along that path that are controlled by a single company. That company is trying to practice vertical integration. And this is one of the hallmarks of modern agriculture, is that streamlining of the process for efficiency and an ability to produce things on a very large scale and deliver them quickly by having all the various steps controlled and regulated through kind of a single mind. Agribusinesses will often sort of outsource the farming part of the job to individual farmers, right? A lot of farms are still family farms, even if they don't exactly look like that. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the lecture here. But a lot of these agribusinesses are literally contracting farmers to produce a certain amount and then size and shape, etc., of a particular product. And it's actually a lot of the food today in MDCs and increasingly in LDCs that's grown in this style as a contract between farmers and agribusiness firms like General Mills or Kraft, Post, a bunch of others you've probably heard of, that purchase the raw materials, these kind of food commodities, from farmers, and then those agribusinesses sort of process them, transport them, engage in all the retailing on that end. The contracts can be very specific in terms of like how things are supposed to be raised, what amount of, you know, food and a particular kind of feed animals might be being fed, how many pesticides or herbicides you're expected to use on your farm, etc. Very specific guidelines that they want people to follow in these contracts. More generally, I mean, they're going to be asking farmers to raise and feed chickens to a certain age and size, for example, to fatten cattle up to a certain weight, to make sure all the apples or tomatoes you're growing are a certain color or size. It's rare, especially in American supermarkets, where we get these very, we think of them as kind of malformed fruits or vegetables, although it's pretty typical for them to grow in shapes that aren't perfectly round and ideally sized, right? But we edit those out at some stage along the process, a lot of times through these contracts that farmers engage in. But contract farming has grown to be a large part of the modern agribusiness world. In the 1960s, about 19% of agricultural products in the United States were produced under contract. In 2003, it was more than a third, right? About 35% or more. And I can only imagine it's grown more since then. If you target in on specific products, specific things that are being produced, it varies even more. In 1980, about 5% of the hogs, of the pigs that were produced for slaughter in America, were grown, were raised under contract. In 2003, it was 72%, right? So depending on the industry, it could be even more than a third, but more and more contract farming is becoming the norm, even in LDCs, where it presents a few other problems to the producers. If you recall from our previous lecture, one kind of commercial agriculture that's practiced in LDCs is plantation agriculture. And that plantation agriculture can often be controlled in this way by contracts between LDC farmers in those countries and MDC companies contracting those farmers in MDCs. And despite there being strong successes in South Asia and places like India, Sri Lanka, etc., critics have pointed to this as an example of neocolonialism, again, where giant corporate firms and MDCs are sort of dictating what to grow, how to grow that food, and all that food is really kind of for export from LDCs to MDCs. It looks a lot like old colonial times to critics of that system. Um, Again, on the other hand, I mean, those farmers in LDCs are being contracted and paid to produce, right? They are selling their labor. But some would argue their situation is sort of being exploited or something like that. The push to expand exports like that between MDCs and LDCs through contract can increase the trouble associated with something known as primary commodity dependence, which is when a country derives a large portion of its income from the export of a single primary commodity, and primary like the primary sector of your economy, right? So things that are mined or grown and harvested and so on, but from the primary sector. So where some commodity like that, like oil or lumber or minerals like cobalt or gold, or food products like cocoa or coffee, um, or whatever, right? When those commodities are accounting for a large portion of your national, GDP or GNI or something like that. When the prices for those commodities are high, everything's fine. Those exporters are doing well, the country's doing well, people are making a lot of profit. But when the prices drop for those commodities, like for example, oil is very cheap right now, the value or price of coffee and cocoa per ton have fallen by almost 50% over the last 5 years. When that happens, it can lead to these severe economic consequences in countries that are so dependent on the sale of those commodities, basically causing recession like circumstances and erasing money that would have been spent on expanding farms and expanding production, and instead having to reallocate the money, the profit made in previous years, to aid struggling producers. So this is a problem that ends up affecting not just sort of the countries, but obviously it trickles down to the farmers themselves, where they might be pushed out of business, maybe bought up by bigger, more successful farmers, right? And continue a trend we're going to talk about in this lecture as well, of farms increasing in size dramatically. MDCs generally have very large farms due to a number of reasons we're going to talk about here in a moment, but over the last 30 years or so, the average farm size in America hasn't changed very little. And most farms remain family owned, as in they are owned by an individual family. Although the idea that you have in your head of a family farm, the images you have, might not sort of match the reality. The the average farm size is around 234 acres. But if it makes sense, most farms in America are not around that size, right? That is just an average. There's a lot of farms a lot smaller than that, and a lot of farms a lot bigger than that, right? And fewer farms sort of in between those extremes. In fact, the median farm size, right, where about 50% of all farms are larger than that number and 50% are smaller, is about 45 acres, right? So half the farms are about 45 acres or less. But we want to talk about how the actual acreage of farms have changed, right? How they've actually sort of grown. So, due to farm consolidation, farms sort of merging together into larger and larger farms as more successful farmers buy up the land of maybe less successful farmers. The acreage of large farms has grown dramatically over the last 30 years, even though the average size has remained about the same. So, to give you another statistic here, about half of all the acres are of farmland are on farms with more than 1,100 acres, and over a third of all that land, is on giant farms of 2,000 acres or more. At the other end of the scale, there's been a similar increase in hobby farms of 10 acres or less, very small farms, right? That are mostly kind of insignificant or not very significant in terms of overall food production, unless they happen to be involved in things like commercial or market gardening, whose farms tend to be pretty small anyway. But the big idea here is that in relation to the growth of agribusiness, the size of farms have been growing as well. And this is kind of a global phenomenon that we mostly see in MDCs, but is happening sort of worldwide and has been happening for centuries. And I want to try to explain to you some of the major, kind of three major factors that help explain this rapid growth. But this is from one of the um, kind of periodical quarterly essays, I guess, put out by the Department of Agriculture a couple of years ago that helps survey the use of cropland and sort of the status of farmers in the United States. If you take a minute to sort of study this, the dark blue on this graph shows the percentage of farms of a certain size, right? So, for example, farms that are between 1 to 9 acres, that accounts for 15.8% of farms, right? Of the actual properties, right? Individual people that are owning plots of land. But farms that size only account for 0.3% of the cropland, of land that's actually being used to grow food. All right. So if you can kind of break it apart like that, you can see the greatest amount of farms are those farms about 10 to 49 acres. But again, that's about 3% of all the cropland, right, are on farms of that size. There's a lot of them. But they don't account for very much cropland. If you look at the other end, you see that most of the cropland is held by these increasingly larger and larger farms that account for fewer and fewer of the properties. But that just shows you that the size of farms has grown, and it's pretty reliable that the food that we eat more likely came from one of those giant enterprises than one of the smaller places. So to break down the why of farm size growth, we can start with a word we've talked about before, economies of scale. All right, larger farms tend to perform better financially due to economies of scale. Remember that economies of scale is the idea that larger operations, whether it be farms or factories, will be able to drive down the cost per unit of production and spend fewer hours of labor on each harvested acre. Those advantages often come from technology. Okay, if you recall talking about this before, and the example of two bakeries, right? One bakery producing bread by hand in a brick oven, and one using millions of dollars of machinery to mass produce bread. The second example has a higher total cost, right? They're spending millions of dollars to make bread, but due to their ability to produce maybe thousands of loaves of bread in a day, the cost per unit of bread is going to be a lot lower, right? That's economies of scale. The profit that bakery makes selling each loaf of bread is going to be higher. It's going to be a more profitable enterprise, assuming they have the business and all that, necessary. For farmers, this advantage of scale can be explained with a few similar reasons, kind of based around technology. One of the first and most important ones being the tractor, which, as far as we're concerned, modern kind of tractors, was introduced around 1924, but would catch on right away. Tractors would go on to replace about 23 million draft animals. So horses, oxen, mules, donkeys, etc. And equally important, would free the land that had been used to support and feed and house those animals, some 79 million acres, for other uses. A lot of it, this change alone, right, boosted the size of farms significantly as mixed crop and livestock farms devoted less of their acreage to feeding draft animals and stuff and more to growing food for commercial sale, or maybe growing food to feed to animals that you plan on killing, not animals that you're going to have help you around the farm for the rest of their life, right? Additionally, On top of that, tractors require less daily maintenance than a stable full of horses, right? If you've got 10 horses helping you do work around the farm, you got to spend time feeding them and watering them and brushing them and maintaining the tack and equipment that you use to ride them and so on, right? And that might take a lot more time than a mechanic once a month coming out to look at your tractor. So there's a lot of labor saving that's going on through using these machines. And that labor, time is money, and you can put that back into your farm for more profitable, productive work. Additional pieces of technology like harvesters, sprayers, planters are all additional inventions that continued to streamline this process, making it ever easier for fewer laborers to perform more work. Perhaps again at a higher total cost because of the cost of these machines, but at a much lower cost per acre, especially when you consider how large farms are going to grow. Again, so just as significant as the work that's kind of being done is the time that's being saved by these machines. Once again, allowing time to be spent planting or preparing more acres, for example, which means more profit potentially. The last kind of set of technologies is chemical technologies, right? Pesticides, herbicides, and then biotechnology that we've talked about before, like genetically engineered crops. Those can bring further advantages by reducing the amount of times farmers have to spend pulling weeds or paying others to do so on their giant farms. Not doing so, they would risk reducing their yields, right, as the weeds kind of eat up some of the nutrients. Um, the introduction of genetically engineered crops, some of which might be engineered against weeds or bugs, for example, can eliminate the need for spraying pesticides and herbicides altogether, further streamlining it, right, and saving even more time, although again at a higher cost, probably total cost, probably for buying those more expensive seeds. But if it lets you plant another 100 acres or something, you might make all that money back very easily. And this is a map from your textbook that you've probably examined a little bit already in completing your reading, but gives a good look at the distribution of tractors per unit of farmland, right? Or vice versa, sort of the amount of farmland per tractor. The more the greener it is, sort of the more tractors there are per chunk of farmland, which means more machinery being used, right? And probably much larger farms being able to be harvested. Remember that a hectare is about 2.5 acres, I think. The other reasons for farms growing in size is kind of circular, right? They've grown in size because they've grown in size. Consolidation and specialization is a trend in most industries and a cornerstone of capitalist ideology and global trade. Um, Farms have been increasingly sort of specializing in a task and getting rid of land or repurposing it to help in that specialization. So what this means, for example, is that there's fewer mixed crop and livestock farms today than there maybe was in the past. That in the past, most farms were kind of mixed crop and livestock, especially if they were subsistence farms in the West. And farmers were producing crops for themselves and for their animals to eat, as well as having animals graze in pastures and do work, and then also be slaughtered. But none of those tasks being done very efficiently because the farmer's trying to sort of do all of it. Instead, consolidation, specialization is referring to the idea that that mixed crop and livestock farm, they've decided to focus just on growing the crops or just on growing livestock. And that would be specialization. The idea being the more sort of specialized you are, the more efficient you're going to be at that task, and the easier it's going to be for you to turn a profit by focusing on that one job. It's generally going to be more profitable for a rancher to devote as much of their land as possible to livestock housing and waste management and just purchase their feed from specialized grain farmers, or more typically, to raise their animals to a certain weight with that feed before sending them to a CAFO, or a concentrated or confined animal feed operation, a CAFO or CAFO, a confined animal feed operation, like you see here, where animals are kept in very small quarters. The idea almost sadistically being, right, the less they can move around, the less exercise they get, the quicker they'll sort of fatten up, right? So confined feed operation. In addition to that, by having them confined and packed in together, you can fit many hundreds, in fact, many thousands and tens of thousands of animals like hogs or cattle or chicken onto a single farm, although the conditions for those animals are going to be abysmal. But I mentioned in there a situation where you have a mixed crop and livestock farm that has essentially over decades become two separate farms, right? A grain farmer producing corn or grains to feed to livestock strictly, right? The majority of their produce might be going just to feed animals on the cheap, and livestock ranchers and feedlots and stuff that are focusing just on raising animals to help drive down costs at either end. In that sense, animal production is an excellent example of sort of the food chain and agribusiness, where you have, for example, a ranch raising animals, grain farmers sending food to feedlots, the feedlots and the confined animal feed operations fattening animals before final sale. Those livestock are being transported, butchered, packaged, sold, distributed by a separate set of companies, right? That is sort of agribusiness in a nutshell. But this style of farming, especially the use of confined animal feed operations, comes with consequences. The upside of it is that that style of production allows enormous amounts of meat to be produced cheaply. And it's unlikely that the American diet would look the way it did if we could not produce meat so cheaply. Where, I mean, it might be common for a lot of us to eat meat as a part of our diet every night of the week, right? Meat might be the main thing on your plate potentially. But, that's not without steep costs to the animals in the environment. The conditions animals are kept in confined animal feed operations and CAFOs are considered cruel by many. There's little room to move, as we mentioned, to restrict exercise. The conditions are dirty. These are animals like pigs and cows that are producing waste like everything, right? It's so dirty that many animals are given regular doses of antibiotics in these conditions to counter the negative effects of their extra fattening diets that produce all kinds of negative side effects within their gut biomes, and also the unsanitary living conditions, just these animals walking around in their own and the waste of thousands of animals all the time with maybe little cuts or scrapes on their bodies that are easily infected. And so something like 70% of America's antibiotic use is accounted for by use on livestock. This causes all kinds of other problems, right? It increases the rate at which antibiotic resistant superbugs are created, for example. Additionally, and kind of related to that, confined animal feed operations produce gross amounts of waste, feces and urine, right, from the thousands of animals kept in such small areas. Often, let me see, I got an image of it here. Often, that waste is literally pooled in ponds of excrement that are millions of gallons in size, right? Lakes of pig poop and pee, right? Just pulled up outside of that farm. The runoff from those lagoons, those ponds of feces, contaminates groundwater and other water sources. It kills vegetation when rain falls or when it floods. A lot of these farms are in parts of the south or east coast where the flooding of rivers and things like that is not uncommon. When that happens, these ponds overflow and wash over huge amounts of the countryside in really, really disgusting results, right? If you take a minute to sort of study this image I've put here, which is produced by the Sierra Club, an environmental group, right? So they're definitely biased here, but this isn't exactly a matter of opinion, right? There's evidence here that you can really take a look at. And you look at some of these lagoons, you see they're labeled as 10 million gallon sewage lagoons, and they point off a lot of the effects you can see here of even some of the runoff, right? There are other images. If you just look up CAFO um, images, you will see this is a big problem. Inside of um, those long barns, I'm not exactly sure what to call them, but those barns are where the animals are kept in their large, right? There might be close to 10,000 hogs or something kept in um, some of those pens there. Or not hogs, dairy cows, rather, excuse me. But to sum up, the consolidation of smaller farms into larger farms for matters of efficiency, and to take advantage of economies of scale and the use of that machinery is another sort of easily explainable reason for the growth of farms, although it's come with these secondary effects as well. The last reason we'll look at, although again, remember that there's a lot of reasons to explain why the size of farms have grown, we can look at the issue of government policies, particularly subsidies. Subsidies refer to government payments that are made to certain industries to help regulate supply very generally. And in turn, by regulating supply, it helps to regulate the price for consumers. Subsidies will attempt to stabilize prices by regulating supply. Like I said, to overgeneralize and kind of simplify what can actually be really complex government policy, we can look at two ways that this typically happens. In one situation that was common, especially in decades previously, farmers are paid not to grow. Okay, so traditional subsidies would regulate supply by examining what crops were expected to be in good supply come harvest season this year or maybe several years in advance. And the government will basically pay farmers a fixed price to not plant on those fields, to leave them fallow, right? So let's say, corn is selling for, $1 a bushel or whatever, $1 a bucket. And the U.S. government kind of looks into it, and they see that in the next coming years, there's an oversupply of corn. There's way too much. It's gonna drop the price even more if farmers produce a whole lot more of it. So they will pay farmers some amount, right? Instead of $1 a bushel, maybe they'll pay you 70 cents to leave your farm fallow, to not grow any corn, right? And that will help regulate the supply and in turn regulate demand and the price of that good, okay? And guarantee that farmers also are able to get a larger profit from the food they're selling, right? They're subsidizing that industry. They're giving government money to those farmers to help them profit. Although in this case, they're being paid to keep that land fallow. Another reason for this is actually a smart one. Sometimes it's not strictly economic, but it can be done to help minimize environmental damage. The government also kind of tracks the lands that are at the highest risk for soil erosion since the Great Depression era Dust Bowl and things like that. Um, Government subsidy programs will try to minimize the amount of times farmlands are tilled and planted where that soil is being kind of torn up and maybe blown away in the wind, and instead pay farmers to keep the land fallow, plant some rest crops like clovers, maybe allow animals to graze there, and give that land a break to preserve some of its nutrients. Now, what's become increasingly common is the opposite of that, is farmers being paid to grow. So increasingly certain crops are subsidized in this entirely different way, where farmers are paid a fixed price by the government for crops that are in high supply already, to encourage farmers to grow when they would otherwise maybe not find it profitable to do so. So, an exact opposite of the last example. So, again, for example, if the price of corn for a selling farmer was about $1 a bushel one year, but let's say due to oversupply, that same bushel of corn was expected to only be worth 70 cents a bushel the next year. The government would subsidize farmers. They would encourage them to continue to grow anyway by guaranteeing to pay them that 30-cent difference, right, between the 70 cents a bushel is worth and the dollar it had been worth in previous years. The government will give farmers that 30-cent difference per bushel that they produce, right? So that farmers still receive $1 a bushel, all right? It's due to programs like this that we are able to produce such giant amounts of food and therefore have such cheap food. We might not always think of it like that, but Americans are able to feed ourselves on just 10 to 15% of our income. It can be as high as 30% or more in other countries. That's a really great rate, when you're comparing it globally, and it contributes a whole lot to American wealth and luxury, right? Our standard of living in part comes from the very small amount of small amount of money we actually have to spend on food. But a policy like that, where you are paying farmers to grow and sort of guaranteeing their profits, even when they're growing something that is unprofitable, has contributed to the growth of farm size, right? If I'm going to pay you for every acre of corn you're planting, whether you plant it or whether you can profit off of it or not, again, you might bring into production hundreds of acres of your farm you otherwise were going to leave fallow or something, or buy up your neighbor's farms so that you can produce even more and turn a greater profit. There is a documentary I would love for you guys to watch. If I could offer you extra credit, I would give it. But on Amazon Prime, there is a documentary called King Corn. I would normally show to you guys in class. I would love it if you watched it, especially as a way to sort of wrap up the agriculture unit, because it touches on almost every single topic we've discussed as a part of this unit here. But those three reasons together, sort of the government policy of subsidies encouraging farmers to sort of plant on more land, encourages farm growth. The consolidation of small farms into larger farms to take advantage of economies of scale and the machinery used to efficiently work those large farms are all factors that have contributed to the growth of farm sizes in the United States and globally too. Now, but subsidies don't come without kind of drawbacks themselves, right? The downsides of subsidies are that they can lead to these enormous surpluses that get disposed of in good ways, right? By international sale or through government aid to foreign countries when there's a famine somewhere. But, there's no free lunch, I guess, to use a kind of joke there. A flood of cheap foreign corn to an LDC can disrupt sales and prices for local farmers, right? If I'm able to produce this corn so cheaply because I'm being subsidized by my very rich government in the United States, and I'm exporting those crops to subsistence farmer countries, right, and LDCs who receive no subsidy assistance or no help like that, I'm probably going to be able to sell that surplus corn in their country for cheaper than local producers are able to make it, right? I'm going to undercut local producers and put those guys out of business. Even though, on the other hand, I'm also feeding people in a country that otherwise might starve, right? So what do you do in that situation? I don't know. The other idea is that this is corporate welfare, that the largest recipients of that subsidy money typically the largest family and corporate farms, not smaller, less profitable enterprises, right? So if you look at the payouts on some of these companies here, these farms, it's in the tens of millions of dollars, right? The biggest recipients of subsidy money. For red team and blue team in America, both can have members that find something disagreeable about this. The last topic I want to touch on with you is sort of the growth and sort of globalization of the food trade. The growth of farms and agribusiness is part of the growth of the global food trade, an effort to kind of globalize the production of food according to a lot of the international trade approaches we've talked about in other units that are focused similarly on specialization rather than self sufficiency. And that presents several important problems for a lot of countries. As population has exploded over the previous century by many billions, the need for food has increased as well and continues to increase. MDCs have already accomplished great increases in expanding food production, following the methods and techniques we've discussed in this and previous lectures on the green revolutions and so on. LDCs have also seen dramatic gains in pursuing those techniques, but they continue to lag generally far behind, so that today some parts of the world, both MDC and LDC, are net importers of food, as you can see displayed on the map here. And some parts of the world, again, both MDCs and LDCs, are net exporters of food. LDCs seeking to sort of expand their production and become kind of exporters themselves run into problems faced by LDC farmers that had previously tried to embrace the methods of the Green Revolution, for example. That purchasing all the agricultural inputs, the seeds, the fertilizers, the machinery, is really expensive. And usually all those things need to be sourced through MDCs from these developed countries that make the tractors or produce the genetically modified seeds. And LDC farmers, in order to finance that, will typically generate the funds to buy those um, inputs like fertilizers and seeds and machinery by producing high demand crops for export, right? Something they can do depending on where they're located, because they might be able to produce out of season fruits or vegetables that MDCs will pay a lot of money for to get strawberries in the wintertime, right? Or whenever you can't normally get them. But this shift to maybe subsistence farmers and LDCs trying to generate funds to expand their own farms, so they start growing these out of season crops for MDCs, that causes different issues as well that we can explore for a second here. One issue is that farmers kind of shifting to that method of growing these high demand out of season crops encourages primary commodity dependency, which is bad for the reasons previously discussed. Another is that it also increases just general dependency and food insecurity. These farmers, by devoting increasing amounts of land that otherwise might have been used for subsistence agriculture, by them devoting more land for growing food for export, puts LDCs in a situation where their subsistence farmers are no longer growing adequate supplies to feed themselves, right? To feed the country. And so the money raised by exporting out of season fruits or vegetables or other commodities that was, you know, intended to be diverted to agricultural expansion oftentimes ends up having to go to purchasing food off the global market to feed farmers that are now focused on commercial exports. The globalization of agriculture further can cause issues between MDCs as well, as we've seen recently in our kind of trade conflict with China, where all kinds of agricultural products became the focus between ourselves and the Chinese government in negotiating new trade practices between our two nations. In that sense, the globalization of agriculture can be, again, sort of a food security issue where your country might be very dependent on imports from foreign countries, right? Where depending on the kind of political situation in the world, can be a very dangerous situation depending on how much food you need to import. But I think that is where I will leave it to close the lecture up here. I hope that's helped you. And I look forward to talking to you guys soon to wrap this up in one more final lecture, I think.